Right, John chapter 18, thanking God for the ability to approach the end of the Gospels in general. And once again, haven't made a whole lot of mention of it, but the story of the crucifixion of the Christ is one that is, for me, it's difficult to hear, it's difficult to explain, and in this chapter, it's going to be difficult for me to do justice to the summary, but for time and expediency sake, I want to lean into some themes that I see and quite possibly cut the summary a little bit shorter than it deserves. And in not doing proper justice to the summary, that actually leans into one of the themes, and that is the recurring theme of the injustice done to the Christ in this chapter that leads off with his arrest and the beginning of his quote unquote trial. Before Annas and Caiaphas, two of the high priests, one a former high priest and the current high priest at this time, then leading them to Pilate, as it's going to seem that Pilate may have more of a dispute with the people than he does with the accused, the Christ. With that, though, the first 11 verses of John's description of Jesus' arrest are going to be roughly similar to what we saw in the Synoptic Gospels, as Judas, having procured a band of soldiers in verse 3, a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, is going to lead them to a place that he's familiar with, because frequently enough, it seems, Jesus met there with his disciples. And as he brings them there, the thing that caught my attention was the question that Jesus actually asks to them, verse 4, saying that he, of course, understanding what was happening, is going to ask them, "Whom do you seek?" And after they respond, Jesus of Nazareth, he is going to answer, "I am he," at which point it's eventually going to say in verse 6 that they drew back and fell to the ground, a point that I want to circle back to as we begin to summarize some themes. Understanding I don't think that I mentioned, let's title this chapter Dogs, and I think it's going to have to do with things that I saw not only in this exchange between Jesus and the band of soldiers, but in some of the things that we will see as his trial progresses. And so the first waypoint or marker I'm going to put in the summary is right there as we continue on to show that after falling back, they eventually get themselves together, arrest Jesus, and then begin to proceed, or I guess march him around to different bands of individuals interested in finding enough dirt on him to justify a crucifixion. But of course, they're going to find it difficult, understanding they really don't have much because they're basically making stuff up. But in that effort, verses 12 through 14, we're going to show how they began at the house of Annas. Verse 13 saying, "For they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year." So beginning at Annas' house, they are going to question him, giving Simon Peter the chance to make good on his efforts to stay loyal to the Christ. As verse 15 is going to show us, going from verses 15 on through 18, how he followed. But there's a dilemma. It's going to seem to be in a time of year where it was cold. And so another one of our recurring themes is going to be Peter warming himself by their fire. But this instance where he is following, still trying to stay loyal, following along with another disciple, as verse 15 is going to describe it, one who was known to the high priest and seems to have gotten them the kind of access that they might not have otherwise had to the proceedings. Peter's going to follow, but the access is still not going to make him close enough to be able to be as loyal as he would like to the Christ. And so in verse 18, we're going to see that as he is questioned, actually verses 17 and 18, we're going to see that he's going to be questioned the first time as to whether or not he also is one of Christ's disciples, at which point he is going to say that he is not. Like we said, verse 18 saying that because of the conditions, he was warming himself by their fire. Verses 19 through 24, going on to show how the high priest is going to question Jesus, but because they were trying to make stuff up, they didn't get enough there. And so they are going to, in that exchange, ask Jesus about the things that he said, at which point he is going to respond that he has spoken openly, as we have seen throughout the Synoptic Gospels and likewise through John. He made it a habit of speaking openly in the temple when he was in Jerusalem. And so he is basically going to say that the things he said are public record. They don't have to pry to find out whether or not he was a different person behind closed doors than the one that he was as he taught in the temple. But that truth is going to get him struck by one of the officers, another waypoint we want to put on our theme of dogs, as we will go on to see that in verse 24, Annas is then going to send him to Caiaphas, having failed to get what he would consider to be sufficient enough, evidence for a crucifixion. Either way, verses 25 on through 27, going to talk about the way that Simon Peter, once again, as he continues to follow, is going to be warming himself by their fire, giving him 2 more chances to then deny that he is associated with the Christ, fulfilling Christ's word in verse 27, which shows that after the 3rd time Peter denies the Christ, at once a rooster crowed. Verses 28 on through 32, helping us to see that Caiaphas then leads Jesus on to the governor's headquarters, at which point they are going to try to turn him over to Pilate to get the evidence that they have been unable to get to once again justify doing away with the Christ. At this point, I'm not sure it's by crucifixion that they are requesting that he die, but it is soon going to be clear that that is their preferred method of execution. But before that, as we mentioned, in that initial exchange, it is going to seem that Pilate has more of a problem with those accusing the Christ than the Christ. That is going to be a consistent theme throughout the quote unquote trial, or at least the interrogation, as he is going to go back and forth with them over what the charge is. And essentially, they're going to give him a non-answer, saying in verse 30 indirectly, if this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you. That's not an answer. That's not a charge. That's evasiveness. And so passing their responsibility to bring a charge, or at least evidence, to Pilate, they are going to pass that responsibility off to Pilate, who is then going to question Jesus, ending verses 33 through roughly, midway, through 38, with the famous question that after Pilate asks if Jesus is a king, he is going to say he was born to be a king, but his kingdom is not of this world. However, within his purpose as a king, he is here, and he is going to say that he came to bear witness to the truth. And in verse 37, everyone who is of the truth listens to his voice, to which Pilate is going to, interestingly enough, respond, what is truth? As it may seem to be dismissive, but it is an interesting observation, understanding that as he then proceeds back to talk to those who have accused the Christ, he is flat out going to say at the end of verse 38, he finds no guilt in him. And as Pilate, maybe pessimistically or even sarcastically, has questioned what is truth, it is unfortunately going to be a question that is very relevant to this crowd, who is going to be unpersuaded by the truth, as he goes back to them, if we haven't already said it, in verse 38, saying, I find no guilt in him. Not persuaded. He is going to try to get the Christ released by, as we've seen in the other versions in the Synoptic Gospels, by releasing to them, according to the Passover custom, 1 prisoner. He is going to ask, would you want me to release the King of the Jews? At which point in verse 40, the chapter concludes by them saying, no, not this man, but Barabbas, leading into one of the points that caught my attention, and that is the way in which this crowd at this time in the assembly of God's people has become perfectly comfortable pardoning the guilty at being Barabbas, and without conscience condemning the innocent, of course, represented by the Christ. And then, of course, famous story about the decline of God's people that does not seem to be confined to this particular period of time. It's a story that seems to be just as relevant today, understanding that Christ himself, before the crucifixion, in Matthew's account, issued a number of woes in Matthew chapter 23, one of those being the way in which they lamented the deeds of their forefathers, condemning the innocent. But God would send out prophets and others who, in future generations, would prove that even from amongst God's people, there would still be those who were comfortable pardoning the guilty while they condemned the innocent. But the dominant theme that stood out to me from John chapter 18 and his description of the interrogation of the Christ really connects back to the prophecies about his crucifixion from Psalm 22, where about verse 16, or actually in verse 16, it's going to say, for dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. going back to the very beginning that more famously states at the beginning of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so in that theme of dogs, this might not be literally quoted in John's description of Christ's interrogation, trial, and execution, but low key, that theme of dogs seemed to be relevant in this chapter where, as we mentioned, roundabout, verse 6, where it says, when Jesus said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. And this isn't going to be a literal corollary, but it reminded me of the way that as long as they've been pursuing the Christ, it's so similar to the way that when you drive by a stray dog, the way that they can chase you and chase you and chase you until you hit the brakes, and then they realize, oh, wait a minute, what are we going to do with a car? And so that seems to be the initial reaction of the officers who, when he says he is the Christ, they just bounce back. They don't have the energy that they might have thought they had as they were accumulating or assembling themselves to go get him. But eventually they do amass the energy to take him into custody, but it is no less, or the process that follows is going to prove them to be no less similar to the description that we see in Psalm 22:16 that talks about the way in which the dogs have encircled him. Because verses 22 through 23, we are going to see as he is being questioned before one of the high priests. I think this is the questioning before Annas. He's going to be asked about what he's spoken. He is going to say, I have spoken openly, and that is going to draw a smack from one of those officers who on his own might not have had any more courage than those who bounced back or fell back when he simply said that he was the Christ, but now feeling empowered in the assembly, as you will see associated with dogs when they pack up. They tend to be more courageous in the pack than they might be on their own. This one that I'm going to liken to a beta now finds the courage to smack the Christ, understanding that there are times when the whole concept of doing too much becomes a thing. And it seems like this one is doing too much. As, like we said, on his own, he might not have been any more courageous than the ones who were afraid to arrest Jesus, not only in the initial arrest here in the garden, but there are plenty of times in the past where they were sent to arrest him and they were just like, I don't know. But as we said, the pack can breed pack mentality, which can breed artificial courage, and even beyond that, a desire to appeal to the alphas in the pack, that being the chief priests, etc., who are actually leading the discussion. And so as one who might feel his responsibility to stand up on their behalf, he does way too much in responding to a simple response from the Christ. Understanding that for all of the positives attributed to dogs, the fact that they can be super loving, super kind, and pick you up in situations where others just might not be able to encourage you with that kind of affection, they also can give affection without regard to integrity. And that is the problem that we see when people begin to take on that side of the characteristics of dogs. And just as they are showing a loyalty to the chief priests, etc., without regard to integrity or quite simply right or wrong, it's going to get worse the more the mob grows. As the scene plays out in front of Pilate and then in front of the people, as he's going to go back and forth from questioning the Christ to trying to reason with them that they haven't found any basis to crucify him, and neither has he. But it's not going to matter because they have gotten whipped up to a point where, likewise, they are resembling dogs, as we mentioned toward the end of the chapter in verses 38 through 40, requesting Barabbas, once again showing that without regard to reason, they are trying to get their way, in much the same way we might expect dogs when they are whipped up into a frenzy to have no regard for that which Christ said would identify his true followers, in much the same way he said in chapter 13 that you would know them by their love. Here during his trial, he says you will recognize those who are genuinely receptive to him when you see whether or not they are genuinely receptive to truth and not simply the portions of it that they find appealing. And thus, when we see the chapter conclude with those who are called the people of God dismissing the truth and proving themselves perfectly comfortable with pardoning the guilty, we see them proving whose they actually are. Proving what Jesus said going back to chapter 15 in his famous illustration of the vine and the branches, as he goes on to talk about those who would prove to genuinely be his disciples. We are seeing the crowd prove that they are not. However, the mercy comes in the way that this connects to the introduction to Acts, as by the time we get to chapter 2 in the famous sermon from Peter on the day of Pentecost, many of what seems to be some of these same people who, when they finally acknowledge the truth that this might have been the Christ, they find that they have a fit with God in much the same way his actual disciples did. But the truth was not optional. They had to acknowledge the wrongs and the denial that they'd engaged in the past and change to embrace the truth.